Brahma asked, O sage, if the cessation of the movement of prana is liberation, then death is liberation, and all people attain liberation at death. The last chapter or so we've got mired in this debate between traditional yoga and the yoga of self-inquiry. Traditional yoga, although it's very likely that it can lead to higher states of consciousness, it's got nothing to do with liberated consciousness. Liberated consciousness is the realization of consciousness. It's got nothing to do with higher states of consciousness, it's simply consciousness. And often in the Yoga Vasishta, the traditional yoga is dismissed. But there seems to be other voices at work here who can't let go of the traditional yogic practices like pranayama and kundalini and notions of prana. If prana isn't the breath, then what is it? Unless you've got direct experience of something, I'd be very suspicious of its existence. I realise that's an absurd statement from a conventional point of view, but from a spiritual point of view, we are concerned with what is happening right here, right now, not with ideas about what is happening right here and right now. So we get statements like, we've got to stop the mind, cessation of the mind, resort to the silence of deep sleep. When you understand these things from a traditional yogic point of view, it's really a pathway to disaster, spiritually speaking. Maybe there's other benefits. And so we get this idea also that prana has to be stopped. Prana has to be stopped up. And that's supposed to be liberation. But this is what happens at death. The prana stops. So this is yogic theorizing, which there's an attempt to come to terms with here. It's not really of much interest from a spiritual point of view. Vasishta replied, O Ram, when prana is about to leave the body, it already makes contact with those elements with which the next one is to be fashioned. These elements are indeed the crystallization of the vasanas of the jiva. The vasanas are psychological conditioning, memory store, past impressions and predisposition. They're the reason why the jiva clings to those elements. So the idea is that on death there's a kind of psychological or emotional potential which still needs to be worked out, and it will gather the necessary elements together in order to work itself out. And although I tend not to think in terms of reincarnation, I don't see much point really in insisting on the reality of it, although it's a useful way of thinking. It seems to me very likely that the emotional momentum, the psychological momentum which takes us on from one moment to the next, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't carry on after death, any more than a wave on the ocean just suddenly stops. It has to work itself out. And our psyche, which is the sum total of everything that drives us, everything which creates our inner tone, that has to be played out. We can play it out in this lifetime, or it has to be played out in another time. So we're like waves, these different lives are like waves, and the force of the wave is what's propelling it along. Because a wave is physically different. When it's here, it hasn't got any of the same physical components as to when it was here. It's a force. The wave, the force of the wave shapes the water particles into a particular shape here, and then that force shapes the water molecules into a particular shape here. It's a completely different set of water molecules here as there is here. So the only thing that's consistent is the force. The force is invisible. Physical forces, all of science is based on physical forces, but forces are completely invisible, completely beyond our senses. That's quite clear in the simple matter of a water wave. So why can't the force of our psyche take on a new physical being, use the physical elements to take on a new shape, just as a water wave does? Well, there doesn't need to be anything mystical about it. It's quite a natural phenomenon. So these are the vasanas. The vasanas are the forces which will allow the psyche to manifest further on. We could argue that's what's recreating our body from moment to moment, in fact. So this is a life force. When the prana leaves the body, it takes with it all the vasanas of the jiva. So the prana is the life force here. It's the force which shapes the water into a particular wave. It's the force which shapes the elements into a particular body. Not indeed. Until these vasanas have been destroyed will the mind become no mind. The mind does not abandon the life force till self-knowledge arises. By self-knowledge the vasanas are destroyed, and thus the mind too. It is then that the prana does not move. So the whole point here is to be aware of these tendencies, these vasanas, this force which shapes our lives. So we can understand then the prana as the force and the vasanas as the form that the prana takes. So when the vasanas have been destroyed, and thus the mind too, it's then that the prana does not move. In other words, the force that takes us from one incarnation to the next has dissipated. That indeed is the supreme peace. It is by self-knowledge that the unreality of the concepts concerning worldly objects is realized. This puts an end to vasanas and to the link between the mind and the life force. So this results from self-inquiry. Vasanas constitute mind. Remember, the mind's our psychological conditioning, it's our memories, past impressions, predisposition. In summary, it's our inner tone, it's our whole inner feeling towards being alive, towards existence. Mind is the aggregate of the vasanas and not else. If the latter cease, that itself is the supreme state. Knowledge is the knowledge of the reality. Vichara or inquiry itself is knowledge. So it's not knowledge in a conceptual sense, it's direct observation. This is what inquiry is.